My name is Bennett Torres, and what you're about to hear was never meant for you. If you're listening right now, it's already too late to go back, because this isn't just a story about a job or a firing or a rich man's son who thought power was inherited like a watch. This is about the moment you realize the system doesn't reward loyalty, it exploits it. And what happens when that system makes one fatal miscalculation? 8 seconds. That's all it takes for a life to fracture. 8 seconds between comfort and exile. 8 seconds between being invisible and becoming dangerous. I was staring at the fine print when it happened, not the bold letters, not the mission statement bullshit framed on the wall. The fine print, the part no one reads because they're too busy believing the myth. Section 12, paragraph 3, 20 months salary if terminated without cause. A quiet sentence, almost polite, like a loaded gun resting on the table while everyone argues about who's in charge. That's when Preston Holloway fired me. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look up from his laptop, just erased me with a sentence. 15 years, gone, like I was obsolete software, like experience expires the moment a younger man walks in with confidence and a spreadsheet. We don't need old-timers holding us back. That's what he said, not angrily, casually, as if he were stating a law of nature. Here's the truth they don't teach in business school. Corporations don't collapse from competition. They collapse from arrogance, from sons who inherit empires but never inherit wisdom, from leaders who confuse disruption with destruction. As I stood up, chair scraping across the floor, something shifted. Not rage, not panic, clarity. The kind that comes when you realize the man across from you has no idea what he's just triggered. He thought he'd erased a line item. What he actually did was activate a clause his father buried like a landmine 15 years earlier. You see, real power doesn't announce itself. It waits. It documents. It anticipates betrayal long before it arrives. And men like Preston, they never read the fine print. This is where the descent begins. When I walked out of that office, no one followed me. That's another truth they don't warn you about. The moment authority withdraws its protection, silence replaces respect. The younger engineers kept their eyes glued to their monitors like looking at me might contaminate their future. These were men I hired, men I trained, men who learned precision from my hands, not from manuals. But fear is the most efficient loyalty program ever invented. I packed 15 years of my life into a cardboard box. Awards, photos, a coffee mug chipped on the rim from too many night shifts keeping machines alive. All of it suddenly weighed less than Preston's opinion. He never came out to watch me leave. That's how corporate power works. It doesn't escort you out with drama. It lets you disappear quietly so no one asks questions, because questions are contagious. Out in the parking lot, I sat in my truck with both hands on the steering wheel, not turning the key. Through the windshield, I could see the production floor, machines humming, systems running, people moving in patterns I'd designed. This place wasn't steel and concrete. It was memory, institutional memory. And that memory had just been fired. Here's something men don't like to admit. Most companies don't actually know how they function. They just know who to yell at when something breaks. The real knowledge lives in people. And when you remove those people, the building still stands, but the soul leaks out. Preston didn't understand that. He thought leadership was about velocity, about cutting weight, about proving he was different from his father. That's the classic mistake of the heir. He mistakes patience for weakness, stability for stagnation. I didn't slam the door, didn't peel out of the lot. I drove home like it was a normal Tuesday. Because when you understand leverage, you don't rush. You let the other man exhaust himself. At my kitchen table, the contract lay open. Yellow highlights, notes in the margin from Harold Finch, a lawyer who doesn't smile unless he's already won. 20 months salary, no cause, no ambiguity. A sentence written by a man who knew exactly who his son would become. Clifford Holloway called it insurance. That's another secret the old lions always know. They just hope they're wrong. I wasn't angry yet. Anger is loud. I was something else. Activated. Because when a system shows you its teeth, you don't scream. You study the bite. And somewhere deep inside that company, gears were already beginning to grind against each other without lubrication. Preston just hadn't heard the sound yet. The call came the next morning. Clifford Holloway. His name on my phone felt heavier than the box I'd carried out the day before. For 15 years, that name meant stability, mentorship. A man who built something real with his hands and his spine. Seeing it now felt like watching a ghost dial your number. I almost didn't answer. Respect doesn't evaporate overnight, but neither does betrayal. "What the hell happened yesterday?" he asked. His voice was thinner than I remembered, frayed around the edges. "Ask your son." Silence, the kind that tells you everything before the words arrive. "He says you were resistant, that you were undermining him." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. When you've lived long enough, you learn that the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs space. And I let the silence stretch until it started to hurt. "You're going to file," Clifford said quietly. "Already did." Another pause, a long exhale. Regret has a sound. Men like Clifford recognize it immediately because they've heard it before, usually too late. "I warned him," he said. "I told him to read the contracts, told him there were protections." That was when the truth surfaced. He hadn't written that clause for me. He'd written it for this exact moment. Fathers like Clifford don't stop being fathers when they retire. They just run out of authority. "He cleaned house," Clifford continued. "You You, Russell, Angela, 12 people, everyone over 50. There it was. Not strategy, not optimization. Fear, the oldest insecurity in corporate history. Remove the witnesses. Get rid of anyone who remembers how things work before you arrive. Russell Malone, 14 years of engineering intuition. Angela Lawson, quality control so tight the FAA never questioned a single audit. Fired, not because they failed, but because they couldn't be controlled. This is how corporate purges actually happen. Not with violence, with HR meetings and polite language. With phrases like new direction and culture shift. Clean words for dirty decisions. Clifford's voice dropped. I made him promise to keep the core team. Promises are currency sons spend freely when they think inheritance makes them immune. I gave him control, Clifford said. It's his now. And there it was, the moment every empire fractures, when the builder hands the keys to someone who's never had to bleed for the door. After the call ended, I stared at the contract again. Harold's yellow highlights glowed under the kitchen light. But this wasn't about severance anymore. Money is loud, but it's shallow. This was about something deeper. Value, what experience is worth, what loyalty buys you, and what happens when a man mistakes authority for understanding. I looked out the window at the maple tree my wife and I planted decades earlier. It had survived storms, disease, lightning, because it was supported when it was weak, not cut down for growing slowly. That's when I started making calls. Because when institutions forget their elders, the elders don't disappear. They reorganize. By the time I'd made my fifth call, I had a rough idea of what I was dealing with. Preston had done his homework, fired the old guard, cleared out the dead weight, or so he thought. But what he didn't count on was the loyalty that had been built over decades. Not the kind of loyalty that's earned through bonuses or perks, but the kind that comes from being a part of something real, something solid, a culture that values craftsmanship and experience over spreadsheets and buzzwords. Russell Malone, head of engineering for 14 years, was already on the phone when I dialed. His voice was tense but calm, like a man who'd seen the storm coming long before the first drop fell. Bennett, I was going to call you, he said. Did you get severance? A year, not as much as you, though, he sighed. It's not about the money, is it? I don't need a check. But Preston's got this NDA ready for me to sign. Can't talk about proprietary processes for 5 years, me. After 40 years in aerospace. I didn't need to ask the obvious. He wouldn't sign it. No one would. But that was the point, wasn't it? Preston had set the trap, thinking the threat of silence would break us. The irony, of course, was that men like Russell don't need non-disclosure agreements to remain silent. Their knowledge is their bond. Their loyalty is their currency. And no contract, no matter how airtight, can take that from them. I hung up with Russell and made 8 more calls. Most were similar. People who'd been pushed out of their positions for no reason other than they didn't fit the vision. People who'd given their lives to the company only to be discarded when the new boss decided to streamline things. Sam Brenner, our quality inspector, had just lost his health insurance because Preston had slashed his department's budget by 30%. The man had a daughter who needed surgery, and the day after Sam was laid off, that surgery became a lot harder to afford. But Sam wasn't broken. He wasn't a casualty of the system. He was a survivor, just like the rest of us. We were all survivors in one way or another, and now we were about to find out just how strong that survival instinct really was. Preston thought he had control. He thought he could remake everything in his image. New policies, new systems, new faces. What he didn't realize was that control is an illusion. A fragile little thing that looks solid when everything is moving in your favor. But it shatters when the foundation underneath it crumbles. And Preston's foundation, well, it was already cracked. When you push people too far, they stop reacting emotionally. They stop being angry. They stop being scared. And they start to see clearly. What Preston didn't know was that this wasn't just about getting fired. This wasn't just about money or revenge. This was about something deeper, respect. It's a currency far more valuable than anything he could ever buy or threaten away. I put my phone down and stared at the map of the city outside my window. The same city that had been home to Holloway Aerospace for nearly 40 years. The same city where Preston's father had built his empire. But empires, as history shows, are fragile things. And empires don't crumble because the workers leave. They crumble because they forget who built them. Preston had just forgotten that lesson. And now he was about to find out exactly what it meant to be the one who built something, only to watch it burn. 3 days after I was fired, Preston called me. It was the kind of call you don't expect to receive after you've been discarded like a faulty part. I was sitting in my kitchen, the contract still spread across the table, when the phone rang. Clifford's name flashed across the screen. My gut tightened before I even answered. Bennett, he said, his voice cracked and strained like someone who had finally run out of excuses. What's going on? I didn't think you'd take this to court. It's funny how people always act surprised when you choose to fight back. How they suddenly remember the person you were before you were sidelined, before you were the one who had to learn what it means to get out of the way. Ask your son, I said. The words didn't come out harsh or bitter, just flat, like a statement of fact. Don't do this, Bennett, Clifford begged. This isn't what I wanted. I didn't want this to happen. But you see, that's the problem. The old lions, the ones who built the empire, think they can escape responsibility by passing the baton. They believe they can step down and let the young ones make the mistakes, but they still hold on to the illusion that they are free of the consequences, that the bloodshed is someone else's problem now. But it's never someone else's problem. Clifford had given Preston control, thinking that the company would flourish under the new generation. But what he didn't realize was that Preston didn't have what it took to build. He only had what it took to destroy. Preston's clearing house, I said, cutting through the feigned sympathy in his voice. Everyone over 50, all the old guard, Russell, Angela, you know who they are, you know what they've done for this company. And now it's just you and him, sitting in a glass tower, pretending that this is all part of the new direction. Clifford went silent. He didn't deny it, didn't defend his son. He knew. I warned him, he said quietly. I told him to read the contracts, but I thought he'd at least understand the value of what we built. But Preston didn't understand value, not the way his father did. Preston had an MBA from Stanford, a shiny degree that promised success. But no degree teaches you how to make something last. No degree teaches you how to preserve a legacy. No degree teaches you to respect the people who have already made it happen. This wasn't about making money or fixing the system. This was about ego, about a man who thought he could erase the history of a company with a single decision. A man who thought the rules didn't apply to him because he was the one holding the pen now. You're going to file, aren't you? Clifford asked, his voice softer now. A bit of resignation had crept in. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something else, something that I recognized all too well. Fear. Already did, I said again. This time the words carried more weight, more resolve. It wasn't just about a lawsuit. It wasn't just about money. It was about sending a message. Clifford exhaled deeply. I gave him control, Bennett. I gave him the keys to the kingdom, but he's not built for it. He doesn't understand. It's his to run now, but you're right. He doesn't get it. I could hear the faint sound of voices in the background. Probably Preston's voice, sharp and demanding. The son who thought his father's success was his by default. Look, I need to go, Clifford said abruptly, the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air. Just take care of it. I'll call you later. The call ended. I set the phone down slowly. Something inside me twisted. A part of me felt sorry for Clifford, the old lion who'd built something, only to watch his son tear it down with the arrogance of youth. But that wasn't my problem anymore. That wasn't my fight. The fight was mine. The fight was for the men who'd built this place, for the ones who had made Holloway Aerospace the company it was, the ones who had bled, sweated, and lost their families to make sure that every component, every actuator, every turbine housing was built with precision. And Preston was about to find out what happens when you underestimate the people who have already lost everything. I didn't need his sympathy. I didn't need his apologies. I needed the truth, and the truth had a price. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table again, staring at the contract. The details had started to blur in my mind, but I couldn't stop looking. 20 months of salary. That was the leverage, the fine print Preston had never read. It was clear now that the battle wasn't about money. It was about something else, the principle of it. It was about recognizing value. Preston hadn't just fired me, he dismissed the foundation. He de-dismissed the people who had put in the blood, sweat, and years to make Holloway Aerospace the name it was. And in doing that, he'd underestimated how deep those roots went. I wasn't angry. Anger burns through people quickly, like gasoline on a flame. I wasn't going to let him ignite that in me. Instead, I was going to let him do something worse. I was going to let him dig his own grave. By midday, I received the call from Harold Finch. The man's voice always sounded like the calm before the storm. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't waste words. If you wanted sympathy, you called someone else. If you wanted to win, you called Harold. I've got the details on the severance, he said, his tone dry as parchment. We're going to bury them with this. The legal documents were airtight. Preston's arrogance would be his undoing. I wasn't just going to walk away with the money. I was going to make sure this went public. I was going to make sure every corner of the corporate world knew what had happened. You think Preston's prepared for a fight? Harold asked. I think he's going to be surprised, I said, my voice steady. I hung up and stared at the window again, this time with a bit of a smile playing at the edge of my lips. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows across the yard. It felt like everything in my life was in slow motion, like I could see the pieces falling into place, one after another. Clifford Holloway had built an empire, but Preston was tearing it down with the precision of a man who didn't understand what the foundation was built on. His MBA couldn't teach him loyalty. His experience in startups couldn't teach him what it means to nurture something, to protect something, to support something until it was strong enough to stand on its own. But he was about to learn, the hard way. I picked up my phone and dialed Russell again. I knew that he was already making his own moves, but I needed to make sure he understood the depth of the situation. Russell was like a brother to me, and if anyone understood the stakes, it was him. I talked to Harold, I said when he picked up. It's going to be a fight, but we've got them. I don't care about the money, Russell said, his voice firm. But if I have to go to court and tell the world what Preston did, I will. I've got no reason to hold back anymore. That's the thing about people who have already lost everything. They don't fear consequences. They fear nothing at all. I called Angela next, then Sam, then Jason. By the end of the day, I had reached everyone who had been pushed out, each of them ready to stand with me, ready to expose the lies lie. We were a team, not a bunch of former employees. Preston thought he had erased us, but he didn't realize something crucial. We weren't just people who worked in a factory. We were the last line of defense against the hollowing out of something that once had meaning. What Preston didn't know was that people like us don't disappear. We adapt. We find ways to survive. And we wait, because when you've been cast aside by the very system you helped build, you understand one thing that others don't. There is no greater power than the power of the ignored. This wasn't about retribution. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that the next time someone like Preston walked into a company and decided to clean house, they'd know that there are consequences for erasing the people who made it all possible. I look back at the contract again. The yellow highlights almost seemed to glow now like a beacon. 20 months salary. But it wasn't the money that mattered anymore. It was the message. And soon, Preston was going to get that message loud and clear. The next few days felt like a waiting game. But it wasn't the kind of waiting where you sit and stew. It was the kind of waiting where you prepare, where you make sure every angle is covered, every detail is locked down. Because I knew one thing for sure. Preston wasn't going to take this lying down. Not when his ego was involved. That's the thing about power. It has a way of distorting reality. When you've never had to fight for anything, it's easy to think the rules don't apply to you. Preston thought he could erase everything I'd built. He thought he could dismiss me and others like me with a few cold words and some fancy buzzwords about efficiency and optimization. But the truth is, when you erase people like me, when you think you can just wipe away decades of experience, you don't just erase the past, you blind yourself to the future. By the time the first legal papers arrived at Holloway Aerospace, I had already started laying the groundwork for something bigger. Harold had been meticulous, too meticulous as it turned out. The minute Preston saw the full extent of what we had, his smug confidence evaporated like smoke. A few more calls, a few more exchanges of documents, and the legal team was on the defensive. They knew they were walking a fine line, but they also knew one thing: the contract was airtight. And the last thing they wanted was to go to court over a fired COO and his 20 months of salary. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon. Preston's corporate attorney, Justin, the young guy who had clearly never been inside a real boardroom battle, called with an offer. He sounded rushed, nervous. "Mr. Torres, we'd like to make an offer. We'll settle this outside of court. We're prepared to pay you 6 months of severance," Justin said, almost stumbling over the words. It was the kind of offer you make when you know you're losing, but you don't want to admit it. It was a cheap attempt to buy my silence. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window again, listening to the quiet outside. That familiar sense of control was starting to settle in. 6 months. I repeated, my voice flat, nonchalant. "Not quite 20, is it?" I understand this is a significant amount of money," Justin said, "but we need to close this quickly. We'd rather avoid the publicity." "Of course you would," I said. "But here's the thing, Justin. It's not about money anymore. It's about something else. It's about the fact that your boss thinks he can walk into a company, fire people who built it, and walk away with a pat on the back. It's about a man who's forgotten what it means to actually run something. So no, I'm not taking 6 months. I'm taking what I'm owed. 20 months, or we go to court, and we make it public. We start with why people over 50 got fired on the same day. Why none of them had performance reviews or documentation. Why no one can answer a simple question about the decision-making process." Justin was silent for a long moment. I could hear him flipping through papers, probably looking for a way out. He was looking for the backdoor clause, the get-out-of-jail-free card that he knew wasn't there. "Look, he started. "No, Justin, it's over. Your client made a mistake, a big one, and now it's too late to fix it." I hung up before he could respond. I wasn't worried about the money. I wasn't worried about the legal battle. I wasn't even worried about Preston anymore. This wasn't about any of those things. This was about something deeper. It was about watching a man like Preston destroy everything he had inherited because he thought it was his birthright. And it was about showing him that power doesn't come from titles. It comes from what you build and how long it lasts. Preston thought he was untouchable. He thought he was the master of the game because he had the fancy degree, the resume, the right connections. But he hadn't built anything. He hadn't put in the years. He hadn't sacrificed. And now he was about to learn what happens when a man who has built nothing tries to tear down something that took decades to create. This wasn't just about a lawsuit anymore. It was about legacy, about who gets to define it and who gets to erase it. I wasn't just going to settle for my severance. I was going to make sure Preston Holloway understood exactly what he had done. And in doing so, I was going to make sure no one ever forgot the cost of ignoring experience. That's when I made my next call, Clifford Holloway. The call to Clifford wasn't something I'd planned. It wasn't part of the strategy. But there are moments in life when the weight of the situation forces you to do something you didn't anticipate. This wasn't just about getting back at Preston anymore. It was about understanding the kind of man Clifford Holloway had been and realizing just how much of this mess he had left unfinished. I dialed his number, the screen lighting up in my hand like a confession. The phone rang twice, and then I heard the familiar, strained voice on the other end. "Bennett," Clifford said, as if he'd been waiting for this call. "I guess we need to talk." He didn't even need to say say anything else. The quiet between us spoke louder than anything either of us could have uttered. The resignation was there, thick in the air. Clifford knew that what had happened, the decisions that had been made, were irreversible. The damage had been done. "I'm not going to settle," I said, cutting straight to the point. "Preston's offer was laughable. I'm going for the full 20 months. Clifford sighed. It was the kind of sigh that comes from someone who knows they failed in a way they can't undo. "I understand," he said, his voice growing thinner. "I never wanted it to come to this. I thought Preston would understand the value of what we had, of what you did." But he trailed off, and I knew where this was going. Clifford wasn't the kind of man to make excuses. He never had been, and he wasn't about to start now. But the truth was there, even if it wasn't spoken aloud. Clifford had handed his son the keys to a kingdom and had never prepared him to hold the weight of it. "What happened, Clifford?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. "When did it become okay to tear down everything we built?" "I don't know," he replied. "Maybe I was naive. Maybe I thought I could leave it to him and trust that he'd see things the way I did. But that's the mistake, isn't it? You can't just assume someone will know how to protect what's already been built. You can't assume they'll see the value in experience, in hard work." There it was. The moment when a man who had built an empire finally admitted the truth, that he hadn't done enough to prepare the next generation. He hadn't instilled in his son the one thing that mattered most: respect. Respect for the people who worked for you. Respect for the people who helped you get to the top. And respect for the foundation you built with your own hands. "Preston's going to learn the hard way," I said, the words almost tasting like victory. Clifford didn't argue. He didn't try to defend his son anymore. His silence spoke volumes. The old man knew exactly what was coming. He knew that the fire Preston had started couldn't be put out. Not now. Not after all the mistakes he'd made. And honestly, I think Clifford was relieved. In his own way, he was preparing himself for the fallout. I wasn't interested in comforting him. I wasn't interested in telling him everything would be okay. It wouldn't be. There was no coming back from this. "You should have known better," I said, my voice sharp now. "You should have seen it. You handed him control and let him clean house. But you didn't make him understand why the people you're pushing out were important. You didn't make him understand what experience means. And now he's going to tear the company apart, and you're not going to be able to stop him." Another long silence. Then Clifford's voice, softer now, almost regretful. "I can't stop him anymore, can I?" "No," I replied. "You can't." There was no comfort to be found in that statement, and Clifford knew it. "I'm sorry, Bennett," he said, the words heavy, laced with the burden of his failure. "I tried to protect you. I tried to protect everyone, but I made a mistake. I gave him too much too soon, and now," he let out a bitter laugh, "now it's all coming down. Now it's your son's problem," I said, my voice detached. "But don't worry, Clifford. I'm going to make sure he understands the consequences of his actions. I'll make sure the world knows what he's done, what we built. Because at the end of the day, Preston doesn't get to erase any of it. He'll learn that lesson." "I hope you're right," Clifford whispered. "But you have to understand, I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to destroy what we created." And just like that, I realized something. Clifford Holloway wasn't just a victim of his son's ambition. He was a victim of his own failure to protect the legacy he had built. He had handed over control without properly preparing Preston to hold it. I hung up without saying goodbye. In that moment, something shifted. I wasn't just fighting Preston anymore. I was fighting the system that allowed this kind of arrogance to flourish. A system that rewards the flashy, the ambitious, and the young while dismissing the very people who hold the knowledge and experience that keep the wheels turning. Preston wasn't the only one who would learn the hard way. The whole corporate world was about to see the cracks in the system. Because when you build something on a foundation of ego and ignorance, it doesn't take much to watch it crumble. And I was about to make sure that every corner of the industry knew it. A week passed, and the pressure began to mount. I could feel it in the air, thick with tension. Preston had underestimated me, and I was making sure he felt every ounce of that mistake. The legal team was scrambling, trying to fight back, but every move they made only dug their hole deeper. Every threat, every attempt to settle under terms that were in their favor, only pushed me further into the corner of victory. They had no idea who they were up against. But this wasn't just about a lawsuit. No, this was something much bigger than that. This was about exposing a system that allowed people like Preston to rise to power with nothing but ambition and entitlement. A system that rewarded those who could talk a good game, who could make flashy presentations, who had the degrees and the charm, but no true understanding of what it took to build something of value. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the truth. And I was going to make sure the world saw it. The media had begun to catch wind of the story, and soon enough, the rumors started circulating. It wasn't just about the firing of a COO. No, it was about how a whole team of experienced, skilled professionals had been let go in one fell swoop. It was about how people who had built the company with their hands were being replaced by a younger, more dynamic team that lacked the experience to understand the nuances of their operations. And that's when Preston's world started to crack. You see, Preston thought he could get away with the quick fix, the disruption, the young MBA's dream of tearing down the old ways and replacing them with something shiny and new. But he never considered one thing. The people he'd gotten rid of were the ones who had kept the whole thing running. They weren't just numbers on a balance sheet or names on a payroll. They were the glue that held it all together. Without them, Holloway Aerospace wouldn't have survived, let alone thrive. I got a call from one of the former engineers, Jason, the one who had quit 2 weeks before everything went down. Jason had been one of the best in the industry, a quiet genius with decades of experience behind him. Preston had slashed his budget, and when he found out Jason wasn't going to roll over, he'd forced him out. But Jason wasn't one to back down. "They've got no idea what they're doing," Jason said on the phone, his voice low but filled with an anger that had been building since his departure. "They're cutting corners, Bennett. They're tearing apart the very systems we put in place. The engineers coming in, they don't know the first thing about what it takes to make this stuff work. They're not even looking at the data the way we did. It's all rushed. They're pushing deadlines with no regard for the safety standards we had." Jason had always been level-headed, never one to jump to conclusions without facts. But hearing him speak this way, the frustration in his voice, it was like the last thread of control had snapped. And he wasn't the only one. Angela, Russell, Sam, and the others, they were all watching, waiting to see if Preston's destruction would result in disaster. But the worst part, Preston didn't care. He didn't even notice the cracks. To him, everything was moving forward. New hires, fresh ideas, sleek presentations. Nothing could stop the vision he'd built in his head. And that's the danger of people like Preston. They live in their own echo chambers, surrounded by yes men who inflate their egos and feed them lies. They start to believe that their vision is all that matters, that their ideas are infallible. They forget that the foundations they're standing on weren't built overnight. They weren't built by suits and spreadsheets. They were built by hands that bled and worked late into the night, by minds that understood the risks and rewards of real, tangible work. "You need to know what's happening on the inside, Bennett," Jason said, his voice tense. "I'm telling you, this place is going to collapse. It might take a few months, but when it does, it'll be catastrophic. They're setting themselves up for failure, and they don't even see it. They think they can replace experience with innovation. But you and I both know, innovation doesn't mean jack if you don't have the foundation to support it." I knew what he was saying was true. I had seen it before. Companies rise and fall, and the ones that fall are always the ones that forget the lessons of the past. They think they can just jump to the next big thing without understanding what made the previous model work in the first place. "Don't worry about it, Jason," I said, my voice cold, steady. "They'll learn soon enough. But when they do, they'll wish they had taken us seriously." Jason laughed bitterly. "I hope so, Bennett, but I have a feeling it's going to be a lot worse than any of us imagined." I didn't need to hear more. I had everything I needed. It was time to pull the trigger. I made another call, this time to the media. It was time to make sure everyone knew exactly what was happening inside Holloway Aerospace. The story had to be told, and it had to be told right. I wasn't going to let Preston walk away from this. He had burned bridges, erased history, and now he was about to feel the weight of it all. The press release went out the next morning, and as the first headlines started to appear about a corporate giant teetering on the edge of collapse, about the mysterious firings, about the men who had been pushed out of Holloway Aerospace, Preston's arrogance began to falter. But he didn't know yet. He didn't know the storm was just beginning. The backlash came faster than I expected, and it came from everywhere. The press didn't just report the facts, they sensationalized them. Articles cropped up with titles like "Corporate Giant's Destruction," "How a New CEO Wiped Out Decades of Experience," and "The Firing of 12 Employees Over 50, a warning about the dangers of disruption." It wasn't just the press, though. Word spread quickly through the aerospace community, and soon enough, LinkedIn posts, industry blogs, and forums were filled with former employees of Holloway Aerospace, all telling the same story. Word of Preston's arrogance had become a wildfire, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But it wasn't just the firing of older employees that had people talking. It was the way Preston handled it. The way he acted like he was the one making the hard decisions, the brave decisions, the ones that would take the company into the future. But in reality, he was dismantling a finely tuned machine. As I sat at my desk, reading the latest media updates, I allowed myself a moment to savor the growing chaos. It was hard to deny the satisfaction, but satisfaction wasn't the end goal. This wasn't about me feeling vindicated. It was about showing Preston that power didn't come from youth or ambition alone. It came from the people who built the damn thing in the first place. It came from experience, from blood, sweat, and years of sacrifice. I received a call that afternoon. It was from Harold Finch, and his voice had an edge to it that I hadn't heard before. "Bennett, we've got a situation," he said, his tone grim. "Preston's trying to push back harder now. They're bringing in some heavy hitters, top PR firms, corporate defense teams. He's trying to discredit everything we've said." I could already picture the scene. Preston in some slick boardroom, surrounded by his shiny new team of consultants, trying to spin the narrative in his favor, trying to paint himself as a victim of an old, outdated system, trying to frame me and the others as people who couldn't keep up with change. But Harold's words didn't bother me. If anything, they just made me more certain of what needed to happen next. "Let them try," I said, my voice cold and confident, "because once they start spinning, we'll make sure the truth is the one thing that's unshakable. They'll have no choice but to face the reality they've been trying to bury. Harold was quiet for a moment, and I could tell he was weighing my words. But then, as always, he agreed. You're right. The media's already turned on them. If they try to fight back now, they'll only make it worse. We just need to keep the pressure up, and that's what we did. Every morning, more articles dropped. More people reached out. Former employees, suppliers, even competitors, everyone had something to say. It was a slow-moving wave, but it was relentless, and it was starting to drown Preston's carefully crafted illusion of control. The best part? Preston was getting frustrated. You could tell. I could hear it in his voice during the few times we spoke on the phone. There was an edge of desperation creeping into his words. Ben, he said, the second time we spoke, this has gone too far. You need to stop this now. I'm offering you a good settlement. We'll take care of everything. This is just getting out of hand. I had to chuckle at that. Out of hand? I thought. It had been out of hand the moment he decided he could just walk into Holloway Aerospace and erase everything that came before him. You should have thought about that before you fired me, I said, my voice calm but firm. This isn't about money anymore. You've made this personal, Preston, and now you're going to pay for it. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, in the most defeated tone I'd heard from him, he muttered, I didn't want this to happen, you know. I thought I was doing the right thing. I wanted to laugh again, but I held it in. This wasn't the time for satisfaction. This was the moment when he needed to face the consequences. The arrogant, naive decisions he'd made in his haste were coming back to haunt him, and there was no escaping it now. The world was watching, and he didn't have the power to hide anymore. Preston, I said, my voice lower now. You don't get to erase 20 years of experience and then ask people to forgive you when everything falls apart. You don't get to tear this place down and then beg for mercy. You made this mess. Now you're going to clean it up, but I'll be damned if you do it on your terms. I hung up before he could respond. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. There was still one final move to make, one last piece of the puzzle to put in place. Preston had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. But when the final shoe dropped, when the industry realized how deeply they had been misled, there would be no coming back.